Hey,
Hey,
man.
Markus.
Hey, Chris.
So your podcast is it's called Be a Better Artist, and I'm late.
Um, yeah,
I'm not.
well,
I'm
I guess
better.
that's kind of a part of being an artist, right?
That's right. We can use that. We can always pull that.
Yeah. Time management isn't one of the strengths typically.
No, I think it's and I see it's kind of pervasive.
Yeah, I mean, they seem to go hand in hand. Management
Yeah,
and creativity are a bit like two different things, although it's super important to figure out both somehow.
yeah.
But
It is. It is really important to figure out both, and not leave when you're supposed to be there.
that
That's
also.
that's that's the yeah. Is this being recorded now? Are we,
Yeah, we're recording, so there's no like
okay.
official start. But if you want to cut something out, we can do that for
Okay.
sure.
I need to, if we're gonna go like real long. I might need like a bathroom
For
break or
sure.
something.
Yeah, no worries. Just say the word
Let's
and
pause. I have to pee, but we can edit that out. We don't need to include that.
sure. No, let's not take the camera to the bathroom. And yeah, I'm
Oh,
also enjoying this kombucha, so we might have to take a break from my part as well. But
oh, okay, kombucha, nice. I already had coffee, so this is just water.
just
But
water. But that's a nice kind of
yeah,
hammered. What do you call that? Like handmade
yeah, I love this mug, and especially in the summer months because it's a copper mug,
copper.
and
Yeah,
and it keeps things cold. So if you, I like to put it in the freezer, and
yeah.
then I'll put iced coffee in it, and it will kind of keep the iced coffee cold.
Nice. And
It
you could
sort of works.
also use it to like conduct signals in the studio if you put like wires to it.
Absolutely. I
Yeah.
just come back, made this gorgeous composition, and I can just, I'm done.
Yeah.
I'm done after
Well, I mean,
that.
it explains a lot why you make such good music. But
Well,
now it's out there. The secret is known.
it, it's all you need is one of these. You don't need any of this gear. It's
Cool.
just this.
And how much is that?
Uh,
Looks pretty expensive. It's handmade.
it is. It was a Christmas gift. My sister got it for me for yeah, a few Christmases ago. So I don't know actually,
Yeah. Enough.
but
Costs enough. So, do you do you like my shirt? I'm trying to
like
represent.
you're just as I immediately noticed it. So I'm a big Miyazaki fan, and Totoro is my favorite of all his films.
Nice.
I think it was the first one. I'm almost sure it was the first one, and I think it was almost kind of like for him like a trial. Like it was like, hey, I'm just gonna like do this thing and see, if I can do movies. And it's like,
Yeah. It went pretty well.
so it went pretty well. And the music is incredible. And I think
Yeah.
he worked with the same composer for all his films. And yeah, it's timeless,
Yeah.
and it's cross cultural, right? I
Yeah.
mean, every kid can identify with that, and it's just, yeah, it's such a special film to me.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm just trying to represent your Japanese upbringing, but
I,
I guess we could use that as kind of like a really sloppy segue to kind of get into the actual episode. So you're an electronic music composer and producer, and you're probably best known by your moniker Kodomo or Kodomo. I don't know how you want to pronounce
yeah,
that.
that's right. Yeah.
Yeah, and you're also an Emmy award-winning TV composer. Um, you've contributed music to video games like Amplitude and Rock Band. This is your bio on your website, obviously. But before we kind of dive any deeper, is there anything you want to add to that very short and not well constructed CV from my part? But is there anything you want people to know about what you do and what's your
No, that
background?
that that's sort of in a nutshell, straddling those kind of two worlds of media composer, I'd say,
Yeah,
and uh, electronic music producer artist under Kodomo. I do have foil implants. Foil imprint is my foil implant. Yeah, you can
Sounds
see
like
it.
some sort of advanced music cybernetic technology.
From the 90s. Foil Imprints is our label, which was started in 2019. So that's the other component of it is running this record label. But yeah, really those are kind of the three worlds I inhabit.
Cool. Well, we're gonna link everything down in the description that you want people to check out. And Foil is definitely going to be there as well. But I try and structure these in a sort of a very basic, I guess, story way, and I want to really go back to the very, very, very beginning. So where were you first of all born? Because I know you have this Japanese or Japan related upbringing, but I think you were born in the US, or?
Yeah, no, I was born in the US, in Maryland, in a small city called Silver Spring, Maryland. And yeah, I think it was about half a year old, like 6 months is when my family moved to Japan with me.
Yeah. So that was in a very, very early stage. Are your parents both from the US, or?
Yes, they are both American. Yeah.
So why did they end up moving to Japan?
So my father, he's not alive anymore, but he at the time was working in Japan as a diplomat for the State Department, and so we moved around a lot. But Japan was kind of his specialty because he actually had also grown up there and spoke the language and was very familiar at the time. This was like 70s and early 80s. There still weren't a lot of Americans, foreigners. I mean, certainly more so than before. But it was kind of at that time where it was just getting going in terms of like a lot of the businesses and trade and whatnot. So he had kind of a specialty there, and so Japan was kind of his main area, which is why we lived there the longest out of the different countries and multiple times. So typically you would have, like, as a diplomat, you would have between 4 and 5 years in a country. Usually it was around 4, and then you'd be obligated to go somewhere else. So in our case, there's 3 different periods where he was sent to Japan. So the beginning being right after I was born.
Yeah. Okay. So I guess, I mean, how long were you in Japan for in total, and from what age to what?
So yeah, it's a little confusing. I have to make sure I get it right. So I was there initially from about 6 months to 5. And then we moved back to Silver Spring, Maryland for, I guess, about a year, because we moved back to Japan when I was 6. And then I lived again in Japan from 6 to 12. And then we moved to South America, then to South Korea. And then I ended up finishing high school in South Korea. And then my parents moved back to Japan for that third tour, as they call it, for another 5 years. In which I get back as often as I could.
Yeah. So you definitely, like, I've been, lucky enough to, like, my parents traveled a lot when I was young. And so I've seen quite a lot of, like, Europe and, well, a bit of the rest of the world as well. But it sounds like you kind of had that, but on steroids, because you were continuously moving around. Because it's very different to kind of travel for a few weeks and be in a different country. But I mean, this obviously must have had some kind of obviously many effects on you. But maybe could you kind of speak about how that has maybe influenced your worldview, and through that, maybe creativity even. And what was that kind of constant moving process like? Did it sort of, how did it influence your, I guess, worldview and personality and creativity?
Yeah, that's a great question, because it's also one of those that I certainly could not answer at the time, but now having perspective on it can maybe see in comparison. So certainly it impacted everyone in my family very differently. I think it was maybe a little harder for my brother, for example, to adapt to these kind of quite drastic changes. I mean, probably in hindsight, it was hard for me to adapt too. But I do remember being really excited about going and I mean, I have this visceral memory of like, oh, I've never stepped out on foot on this country before. And as soon as, like that was like a big deal to me, that I'm in this new place and what's it going to be like. And so there's this real sense of intrigue. And in terms of worldview, I think a lot about this and creativity, because it's definitely apparent to me when you visit another place, another country, something that you're not familiar with, you're inundated with new experiences, new cultural norms and ways of doing things, etiquettes and cultural histories and traditions, foods, and the list goes on. Art, music, right? Like there's different mindsets, and I think there is kind of this expansive quality as a byproduct that emerges from those kinds of experiences. I find them incredibly enriching. They're I hate the word open-minded, but that it does. I think going to a new place kind of forces one's mind to open in the sense that you're just seeing things being done outside of the way you're so used to seeing them done. And small things like that, it's kind of like these little, like, oh, they do that really, that's kind of cool. I like the way they do that better. I like the fact that they have a place for everything. That's very thoughtful. Or, there's just like little nuances that I think, one can take in and pick up on, that we'd be blind to otherwise. And certainly, visiting a country is not the same thing as living in a country. So living in a country, you really can go deep. And certainly once you get to know the people there, and now what Japan is, right? Like you're actually sort of immersed in that country. You're riding the trains. You're going to school there. It's a whole different experience than this sort of sense that we have of places, right? Like if I have this sense of Egypt and the Middle East, and it's completely filtered through everything that I've, inherited from the media and the news here in the U.S. I have no idea what it's really like. And so I think that's what you're also up against is these inherent biases that we have. And suddenly you're in this place and you're like, oh, it's actually not it's not like that at all. Or there's a lot more components to it. Things are not so black and white. There's a lot of things are not so easily understood, or there's a lot more going on than maybe I thought. And I think that kind of way of thinking certainly made its way into in my experience, having had those experiences of living in those countries, and I'm deeply grateful for that.
Yeah. I think we could solve a lot of problems in the world if people had more opportunity to certainly travel more and perhaps even live abroad. I always tell people who are going abroad to study for maybe like a half a year or beyond, and at least my experience in London was that the first year you're kind of saturated with these experiences and you're kind of getting your bearings and being sort of submerged in this kind of very intensive experience. And then the second year for me was kind of settling in, and by the third year I actually felt more or less integrated with the day-to-day stuff and the culture. So I always tell people, like, half a year is going to go by like that. It's not a very long time at all to be in a completely new place in the world. And so if you really want to go deeper into it, obviously this is individual, but it takes time to really absorb things properly. So yeah. Well, how would you describe yourself as a kid, sort of generally? What kind of a temperament did you have, and what was that kind of being you in the midst of this moving about? How, what was the experience like?
Yeah, I mean, I remember well, and a lot, and I also remember the feedback. I was a pretty spaced out kid in general. I remember, there's like teachers were like, yeah, he's kind of in his own world. But I was pretty quiet. I wasn't. It's interesting having a son now and sort of like comparing the way he's like so much more energetic and like just like full throttle on. And I would say cautious, relatively shy, not like unsocially shy, but I would say more on the quiet, sort of shyer side, and kind of dreamy, spacey.
Yeah.
Kind of really in my own world a lot.
Yeah. I have this kind of very flimsy theory so far. Well, I mean, it's a theory, so it's not like a truth that I'm, announcing to the world. But, I believe that retaining some of that kind of childlike openness and kind of natural access to creativity is something that artists retain as they begin to, grow older and older. Would you say that has been, well, first of all, does that sound correct to you? Does it resonate with you? And if so, how do you think you sort of managed to retain some of that into, well, as you grew up?
Yeah, I think that's very accurate. I mean, I think what you're getting at is this sort of natural, spontaneous awareness and this spontaneous, let's just call it curiosity, and just kind of going with that sort of sense of discovery. And that's always felt the most natural to me. And I had to sort of learn the rest. I've never really been great at the technical side of things, even though we're in this very technical field, right, of electronic music. But that I've always been kind of reference to me comparing to seeing others do this is a lot slower. Like, I need to really take time to understand signal flow and any kind of theoretical framework. It isn't, there's people who just kind of like get that, and that's really amazing. But for me, that's always been very slow for me. I found I kind of gravitated to more just like, well, what does this do and where does it take me? And kind of tinkering in the sandbox mentality.
Yeah.
And I think you need both, and usually it's like one is maybe a little more strong than the other. And in my case, the technical side, like I said, was, I felt there's this like, it just seemed harder. So I think, I've always, but I've also noticed that when things kind of just feel forced or technical, like I'm trying to achieve something technically, it was never very satisfying. And the most kind of interesting experiences and what I create and make and end up releasing generally came about from this sort of discovery mentality of kind of stumbling upon stuff and then noticing what was interesting about it and kind of going there.
Yeah, that's kind
going.
of. No, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I said like I just want to expand on like noticing something that emerged from the sense of discovery, and then kind of chasing that, as opposed to trying to by the technical side of it. To me, almost reminds me of like just doing it by brute force, because and there's this sense of like, well, if I know these techniques, I can put something together, and it's like, yeah, you can, but it's maybe in my experience never is really gratifying.
Yeah. Yeah, that's kind of interesting, because what we're going to talk about more technical stuff later on, but it's very interesting to hear that, because if when I listen to your music, well, I hear a bunch of different stuff that we're going to touch on later, but it still sounds, technically very, very refined, and that wouldn't be something that I necessarily picked up unless I knew you a bit better and knew your work a bit better. So it's interesting how you can still get to results that seem, technically quite, I'd say, advanced in terms of like mixing and even the synthesis side of what you do even. But maybe if we jump into music itself, like how was music introduced to you? Were you sort of guided to it by your parents, or how did you end up transitioning into the world of music?
Sure. Yeah. I was definitely guided into it from my mother. Early on, I was given piano lessons. I always loved it early on. Some of my earliest memories are of her in Japan, in the apartment we lived in, playing the Moonlight Sonata, and just being transfixed by that piece of music, and just thinking, oh, I would like to play that someday. And early on, I was given piano lessons, maybe 4, I think, and I learned by the Suzuki Method, which was a method just learning by ear. So I looking back on it, I think it was a very intuitive way of learning an instrument and really training one's ear, which I think is a great way, in the sort of faster, more intuitive way to learn. I'm not saying it's for everyone, but I think there's a lot of merit in it. And so that was sort of my first experience, was these early piano lessons, and my mother introducing me. And she would play music all the time, classical music records, and she would tell stories with it. So there's always this sense of like, I remember playing Holst the Planets, and each one like felt like a whole universe and a whole world, a whole story to me. So I was very much drawn into this idea of stories and music as well.
Yeah. So when did that kind of begin to? Well, I guess maybe the better question is when did you actually realize or start to think about the option of having music or creativity be your career? How was that kind of transition from those early memories and piano lessons going into like thinking about a career?
Yeah, I think I don't think I actually thought about a career specifically, even as I think I had sort of longed and wished for that, but had no sense of like, this is what I'm going to be doing. I mean, this would now fast forward to like the end of high school, right? And my parents are like, hey, you got to think about college. It's like, everyone's already applied, and what are you gonna do? And so I knew at that point, I did know that I wanted to study music deeper. And it was kind of apparent that, I had gotten to a point where I was decent on the piano, but far from, a proper, piano performer. I had sort of stopped performing and taking serious lessons when I was probably 13 at that point. So, and I still had not learned to read music. So I had no aspirations at that point of piano playing, but I had become very interested in electronic music and synthesizers, and had this urge and desire to create my own music. And so, so like senior year, like 12th grade, I just decided at that point, okay, I'd like to go to study music in college. At least that's going to be my focus. Career wise, I'm not thinking about that.
Yeah.
Like I didn't think that was actually like a reality. I just knew I wanted to sort of dig in and dig deeper with music, because it was everything I was really invested in and cared about, and I wanted to learn more.
Yeah. So when did that sort of assuming you went to college to study music?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And this was where?
So this was at Berklee College of Music in Boston.
Yeah. And what was the time like there as you were studying? Did your sort of vision for like beginning to take it more seriously in terms of like maybe do something that actually gives you money and maybe sort of build the toolbox of being a musician into something that transitions into paid jobs? How did that? Well, first of all, what was the experience like at Berklee, and how did it sort of transition into the next phase?
Well, the experience at Berklee was great for me. I think it was the first time that I felt like I was like good at something, like really good at something, to the extent that like, I took all my classes very seriously. I was sort of like an okay student in high school. But at Berklee, I really applied myself, and I was very committed to study, committed to practicing. I was kind of starting from scratch in some, like in the traditional music areas in terms of notation, but I really put in the time, and I started to make a lot of progress in those areas. And then I ended up doing like the electronic music major at the time, which was called music synthesis, which totally was everything that I wanted to kind of dive into more, and learning synthesis and digging into sampling and production, and there are some great professors there, particular professors who I'm still in touch with, who I think were really important and inspiring to me in this notion of just kind of advocates of the sheer love of creating music for the sake of doing it. Because there was another component to Berklee, which was sort of this more framework of fitting into this mold, and which was generally more I'd say commercial oriented music and a lot of jazz music at the time, which I wasn't really interested in. But the classes were excellent, and like I said, it was a really I look at it as kind of like the kind of crafts learning time for me. In terms of how that segued into a career, all the while, again, I'm not thinking at all about career. I'm sort of like, on like anxiety level, just putting that off. Like, oh, that's still like 4 years away. That's still 3 years away. It's 2 years away, and I'm making, parents are asking, so any prospects for jobs? Like, I don't know. I don't know what's going to happen, but I'm really digging this. I'm making some crazy, like sound collages. We're like, well, what are you going to do with that? I don't know. And so and then 1 year away, and I really had no idea. So one of the professors was like, hey, you'd be a great candidate for grad school. You might want to go that route. And but it was, there's the financial aspect of it. It was expensive and it wasn't really feasible. So I basically ended up, I got a job working for Berklee as like, their like lab monitor. Essentially was like an assistant to their teachers and managing like the synth labs where the kids would, the students would come in and, do their work, and I would assist them. And that was also kind of a good, learning experience for me. But all the while, I really had no notion of, I'm going to be a composer or, whatever it was. I didn't really, I didn't really have a vision of that, until, I saw a few other friends who were doing it, and they were maybe moving to New York or moving to LA. And then I started to think, okay, well, I have some skills here. I should. There are some outlets. There's this great fear of rejection of like, well, it's really hard, and everyone's saying it's really hard, and jobs are few and far between, and it's all who and whatnot. But I started at least getting some stuff together. I would say like getting, it was a CD reel, right? At the time. And it was an interesting time. There was kind of like the .com boom, and so there were a lot of startups, and some of them needed music for websites, some of them needed music for whatever little things they were working on. And I did a few little projects for a few of those kind of companies. Nothing major or anything, but something to kind of get me some experience. And then really the first thing that came up was this I started looking at they had these like weekly job posts through Berklee, and when one of the job posts was this job opening at Harmonix, which was the video game company that I ended up getting a job working with. And the post was like, hey, looking for someone who can make electronic music for a video game. Something to that extent. I was like, that sounds awesome. I make electronic music. That's what I do, and I like video games. So I ended up responding to that. But again, I wasn't really thinking about like, I want to be X, Y, or Z. I would say it was really, my experience was responding to certain opportunities that emerged, and sometimes they worked and sometimes they didn't. In the case of Harmonix, I didn't get hired the first time, and I think it wasn't until 6 months later they were hiring again, because I think they needed more audio people at the time. And then that second time I got the job there. So that was sort of my first proper job in the music industry.
Yeah. And kind of probably assuming that, was this a time when you started to work on your own stuff under Kodomo or?
Yep, that was around the time. I mean, all throughout that period, I had set up a little home studio, which was very. I was collecting gear and constantly messing around with it and making stuff. Nothing that I felt like was ready to put out there. But I would say, at the beginning, or a little through the beginning of working at Harmonix, that was when I started more seriously investing in creating my own music, parallel in what I was doing at Harmonix. And that was also definitely motivated by people who were working there, who were doing that already, and having that model. Casson is a great example. He was in this band Freeze Pop, and he was making music under Symbian Project, and seeing someone do that was really eye-opening for me, because I'd sort of, I'd had, of course, I amassed, thousands of CDs, right? And I'm listening to these artists, but I didn't really know any of them. And actually seeing someone who's, hey, this is someone like me who's working, and they're also are working on their art, and they're doing it themselves. Oh, and you can actually do that. You can make your own CD and put it out there. And there's a lot of legwork, but there's a whole process, and that's actually possible to do. I think that was very motivating, inspiring to me. So I think at that point I'd sort of planted the seed where I think I can do that, and there's a path, there's a path to actually do that. That's actually possible.
Yeah, it's funny how little it really takes for someone to find kind of confidence in seriously trying to pursue like a certain path or an aspiration. And sometimes you only need to see someone who is doing what you're doing and be sufficiently close to them, because obviously we can look at the media and see all these composers and artists who are successful, but having a friend who is kind of maybe breaking the ice and kind of seeing success in what they're doing, that's super important. So, and that's probably why one of the biggest perks in networking is really seeing that it's possible. And it's it's not enough to know in theory that it's possible. You kind of have to see it yourself and say, hey, wait a minute, I can do maybe 60 or 70% of what they can do. So could I have 60 or 70% of their success? And then it can maybe go on from there. But
I think that's framed very eloquently, Markus, and that was very much my experience. It was really like I'm maybe 50-60% of that, and I think I can do the rest if I just if I sort of push myself for it. But certainly having someone that like is close to you and who is in embodying that really removes this obstacle of like, well, that's just so far away, and how would I do that? It's like, oh, you're closer than you think. And I think that's, in my experience, that's our, what we're up against a lot, but we're actually closer than we think.
Yeah. It's about breaking the perceptions that you have and the beliefs that you have. You have to break the false beliefs and, replace it with something a bit more useful, something maybe more truthful. But and also the other thing that I'd like to kind of touch on, which you were in a great position that you had a job that actually, paid for your life, but it was also music and creativity related. And on the side, you could actually work on your own stuff. And I often tell people that, find something that keeps you afloat and do it only to the point where it sustains your living, so that you can free up as much time and mental resources to do the creative work. But obviously, if you can do what you did, which is actually find a job that's more connected to the creativity itself, that's even better. And I recommend people try and do that if possible. So let's kind of jump into kind of inspiration in general. I've seen through like social media that you like to pull inspiration out of many different things, but like I've seen you, obviously you go to nature and you have your walks and you maybe that inspires you, but I think I've also seen you kind of look at paintings and stuff like that. So where do you generally kind of draw inspiration from? Is it always like is it from a single place or multiple places, or how's that process for you?
Yeah, I think inspiration for me, it's everywhere. I mean, everywhere, and let's go specific. But I would say there's so many areas of my life where I find inspiration. Nature is at the forefront. So taking walks in nature, hugely inspiring, and a huge component of rejuvenation for me. And so I'm fortunate to live. I could basically, it's like Finland, I assume, right? Like we sort of
Looks
talked
pretty
about that
similar.
before.
Yeah.
Pretty similar, but Maine and the Portland area, surrounded by beautiful landscapes and these coastlines. There's this kind of quietness. Yeah, it's always nature and these walks and noticing the shifting seasons and light is a large source of inspiration for me. And I would say essential, actually. And certainly, in any kind of cultural art has always been inspiring to me. So going to a museum and seeing how artists work, and exhibitions, and seeing, reading about their process, I find really interesting and inspiring, because I find the like creating electronic music is maybe in a way more similar to a visual artist's process than maybe say a songwriter's, or so the way they use materials and their kind of thinking, I find really inspiring. So really reading about any artist or any kind of significant cultural art, and kind of digging more into how they do things, I find really inspiring. Again, all these things are very much idea generating, right? So I can get a lot of ideas from how they're doing things and maybe apply it to something in the studio. Eating good food is inspiring, and cooking is inspiring. Putting things together and assembling them in a way that is pleasing, and ingredients, that's very inspiring to me. And I think that's a really nice alternative to music for me. It's this notion that I can invest in making something, and with these ingredients that's satisfying, and really digging into all the tastes that come out of that, right? So it's like, it's really like, I think, with music, right, we're just constantly training our ears, and we're hearing details. So with food, right, we're trying to taste all these different nuances. So I see a lot of overlap between the various kind of let's call them sense arts, right? With the visual arts, you're training your eyes, and so I think the more sort of areas of these sort of sense arts that we can encompass, the more it will enhance, in my experience, my own. Great conversations, very inspiring. Philosophical topics, Buddhist ideology is very inspiring to me, and kind of bring that thought process into how I think about and relate to creating music and working in general.
Yeah.
Playing with my kid, that's inspiring. Watching him, how he works in his discovery process, and being reminded of that sort of like raw creative energy, is very inspiring, right? Like, I give him the iPad and he's on GarageBand and he's making something crazy. I'm like, what are you doing? The tempo's at 500. And he's like, why not? I'm like, you're right. Why not? Why not do a tempo at 5? I would never do a tempo at 500, but he, like, why not?
Yeah.
So that's inspiring to me. It's like, So it's these constant like little things like that. So really, yeah, I think I could talk about inspiration for music. I mean, I'm constantly inspired by what I hear, and I'm constantly trying to listen to new stuff. Revisiting music that I grew up on that was really important to me. But playing a piece of music is incredibly inspiring. Really kind of dissecting the architecture of it. I'm speaking mainly towards the classical music that I've immersed myself in and learned very slowly. But that I find really digging into a piece of music incredibly inspiring, because I'm just flooded by an appreciation for the level of craftsmanship, but also all the ideas that I can then get from something like that. And yeah, so it's sort of endless, I think.
Yeah, I mean, to me, it sounds like you have a very, the ability to draw inspiration, I think, is a skill largely. I don't think it's something that, obviously, we all have different kind of temperamental dispositions, I guess, to be able to access inspiration. But I think, at least in part, it is a skill. And to me, it sounds like you've really managed to kind of develop it to a very mature and mature level, but also so that you can apply it to many things, see the underlying structures and patterns. And like you said, it's really the idea behind the medium itself, kind of the interface that speaks to you. And I think if you as an artist can achieve that kind of a place and reach a place where you can draw inspiration from anything, I think that's a super good sign. Going back to, because I'm a musician myself, obviously I want this podcast to be for useful for all creatives if possible, but are there any kind of notable mentions in terms of some of the musicians that have inspired you the most? Could be bands, artists, composers, anything.
Yeah, again, a seriously long list, but all some highlights, right?
Yeah. So it's an unfair question. It's not fair, but
no. It's like a 10-hour podcast, and then everyone would be bored. Yeah. But I'll just throw out some sort of first thought, best thought, highlights. So to me, I'm going to start with Bach. Johann Sebastian Bach. To
OG.
me, I would OG, right? Like, just can't really mess around with 300 years of
Nope.
of lineage. 300 years later, and this, it's still like the top of its game, right? It's I think with the music of Bach, what's amazing to me about it is I had probably connected with, by the time, from the time I was like 6, playing these early minuets, and then just feeling like, wow, this is really cool. Like, there's these different parts. I don't know. There's just something very special about his music to me. And it's just continually throughout, my musical growth, I've always been fascinated with his music, and to this day, it's just it's somehow it's timeless, but it's beyond the power of humanity. It's almost like this universal system. And so to me, there's so much enrichment that comes from listening and studying his music, that I'm putting him at the very top of the list of inspiration, of just this. It's like the powerhouse, right? But it's the solar powerhouse, so it never goes out. Then I'll go over to let's think of I can't just do the classical world, because the classical world is full of but let's just shift over. Next thought is Johan Johansson's music. So again, obvious heavyweight of our era, I feel like, but so unique in the way he's blended all these kind of disparate areas, I think, and even sort of the function of the composer as, this sole writer is really, he's expanded that into this almost like curatorial component of, putting people together in interesting situations and getting something completely different out of it. But I find his music incredibly inspiring and what's the word, reaching towards what I would not think would be possible, really, like pushing real this sort of notion of just like, and I think all good composers, they just push themselves beyond what we all have these limitations of what we think, it can't get more intense, and yeah, it can, and they do that. They find where it can't get, more weird or esoteric, and they make, they somehow make it happen. So I think that sort of mentality in his music is so evident. So I find his music deeply inspiring. I would say I'm going to kind of just go all over the map here. Certainly Kraftwerk was game changer to me. Pure electronic music, like that, the whole, I'd say the lineage of like a lot of the early 80s kind of punk electronic music, Guinea Puppies music was a huge inspiration to me, and he had all these sort of side projects, and I'll segue a little bit, but I'll just mention, like, when I first got into making music, I never wanted to make music with vocals, and I think it was just, I didn't sing, it wasn't natural to me. And so I was creating these instrumental tracks, but I didn't really have a reference for who was doing that at the time. It was always this notion that, I need a singer. And even Skinny Puppy, who had these like, super like crazy instrumental stuff, they still had like a lead singer, but they had this side project called Doubting Thomas, and that was kind of like their sort of experimental, almost like film music, like industrial film music, but it really was very evocative and stood on its own without vocals, and had samples and from films and all kinds of sound collage kind of approach. So that I would say that particular project was very inspiring to me, because it served as a model for, you can make instrumental electronic music. There you can actually do that.
You got the permission.
I got the permission, and they did it really well in a really clever way. And there's probably other stuff like this. And so I kind of went down that rabbit hole of discovering that a lot of these industrial bands like Ministry and Skinny Puppy and Front 242, they had side projects, and their side projects to me were the most interesting. They were maybe not as well known, but they sounded like, to me, a little more authentic, because they were kind of doing something without a notion of needing something, right? I think they were just doing that because that was an outlet for their raw creativity, and they weren't thinking about like, we got, the record label wants us to sell X many, we have our main band for that. This is sort of our side project, but we do what we want, and that really spoke to me. So I think that that sort of era of these kind of like industrial side projects of the time were very inspiring to me, both in terms of like the kind of forward thinking model that they were engaged in with all this, these synths and samplers, and just kind of creating these sonic worlds that were very moody and really descriptive of certain spaces, and like I said, they really were. It was like a soundtrack to a film that didn't exist. And yeah, so that sort of whole era was very inspiring to me. And then growing up and seeing them in the summers, I spent a lot of time with my cousin in DC, and we would go to see a lot of these punk bands play, and I've seen Fugazi play. So there's definitely, like, I would say there's inspiration for me there for sure. Jane's Addiction was one of the first like alt rock bands that I got into, and I was way into to their music, and certainly Nine Inch Nails, big inspiration. And I think that was kind of the beginning of this notion of, synthesizer music, can be pretty cool, and can be a lot bigger, a lot more expansive than what what I'd heard before, and getting into film music and whatnot, rather than just sort of staying in like the song world. That being said, right, soundtrack music for me is a great source of inspiration. One of the early soundtracks that was, I think, a key release for me was the Wendy Carlos Clockwork Orange soundtrack. That was done completely on a synthesizer, I think on the Moog modular, and some of it was playing Beethoven's music on the synthesizer, which sounded really strange and cool. And I was a big fan of Beethoven's music, so hearing it on a synthesizer in this whole other context was really inspiring. And then other tracks were just like completely experimental modular synth collages, which were amazing, and just created this whole visceral world of sound. So that one soundtrack really stood out as a major inspiration. And then I would say sort of the other main kind of electronic music that to me really informed what I do now is the golden warp era of the 90s. So Aphex Twin and Autechre and Boards of Canada and Played and Mila Cox, all that sort of early, what they call IDM music. Again, to me, it was just interesting, experimental, instrumental electronic music that these guys were engaged in, and seeing what they could do with home studio gear in very unique ways, and use them in ways they weren't meant to be used. And they were kind of hacking them and creating, more importantly than the process, they were creating very evocative, interesting music. So their releases were very motivating. They were also motivating from the standpoint that it was very DIY. They didn't have fancy studios. They were maybe using a couple drum machines and a crappy mixer.
Yeah, and that's again something that gives you permission. Like, you see that someone is making this music and seeing this success with something that you also have or could have.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Very much so. And just doing it in a very concise way. They're just focusing on sort of this. It's like, okay, let me see what I can do with this box. You know, I'm gonna like really dig in there, and they're finding something. They went deep into the guts of it, and they found something. They found an art in there. They found an art in the way to express it in there. And they like those early Aphex Twin albums are incredible. Those early Autechre albums are incredible. They still hold up to me as some of the more interesting electronic music today. And a lot of them could come out today and they would be relevant and current.
Yeah,
I think. And there's a number of those releases early on in the Warp era. There's an artificial, I think it was called the Artificial Intelligence series. Those first two records, which was a compilation released by Warp Records, that still hold up to me as like a foundation of let's just say not early electronic music, but like early IDM, for lack of a better word. Art driven electronic music that were records, I think, for me. And techno, let's not forget techno. That's a huge source of inspiration to me. So when I talk about techno, the lineages of Detroit and Berlin, those kind of two worlds of just what I found really interesting about techno is that it's almost like this. It's like freeform jazz, but the electronic version of that. It's just this complete sonic experimentation. The only thing in common is you have a 4/4 beat, but after that, it's very much just timbre based. All this sort of sonic evolution, and so having this sort of freedom to be very experimental and solely focused much more on sound rather than on melodic hooks and whatnot. So I found that those I'd say like the early 90s to 2000 tech, that era of techno was a big inspiration to me, for sure.
Yeah, it's also something worth mentioning regarding like Aphex Twin and these other groups that you mentioned in that section of that time. It's really important. Well, I mean, I don't know for sure, but assuming that they only had, a small set of devices at their disposal, or chosen to use only a small set of devices, really created the limitations that allowed them to unleash their creativity. It's like if they had more at their disposal, they probably wouldn't have mastered those single devices that they chose to make music with, and by really understanding what's in there, you can begin to break stuff in a sense and start creating something that maybe the designers of that device weren't thinking about. And I don't know, maybe you can share some of your thoughts on deliberately creating limitations. But I mean, it seems to me like if you don't have boundaries, then creativity is endless, and then it makes it very difficult to create anything tangible. So you do need to somehow create those limitations. So is that something you do consciously, and how do you create that for yourself?
Yeah, very much so. Great point. And I'm, I feel like I'm constantly trying to create new constraints and limitations. And I think that's one of the biggest differences between doing this now and doing it, say like 15, 20 years ago, when I did have a much more restrained setup and there was very little you could do with a computer. I mean, I remember it was a big deal when I got a computer and, hey, I can record audio into my computer, not just MIDI. I can actually record audio. That was a huge deal. Like that was like, and then even then, you're limited by number of tracks and whatnot. And now, I've amassed all this crap and the software end is just
endless.
infinite, endless maze. And so, you know, I found that I really have to be very deliberate about the constraints that I create, and very deliberate about what I want to set out to do. So I try, when I have a project, to kind of craft it and draft it out to, not to like a T, like where it's just like, okay, it's going to be this, but at least that I have somewhat of a framework, so that I have a sense of what's kind of like the what's the purpose and what's the area that I'm going for in that sense. So, and that's just, it's sort of this outline I'll craft for myself, and then I'll start to think about, well, what are the constraints? What's the gear that I want to focus on? And I try to keep, if it's hardware, I want to really focus it on specific pieces of hardware and not stray from those. And if it's software, because it's so open-ended, I like to spend time kind of designing a system in software that I will work with. So it might be, I'll design this specific template for a specific project, and then I kind of restrict myself to just using that template, or I'll you know, I'll work with certain software plugins only, or certain software instruments, and I try to restrain it as much as I can to a particular focus. And it might not be for a record project. It might just be it might just be for, hey, I'm just going to generate interesting sounds, and I just want to focus on interesting content, and I just want to see what I can do with this program. And I'm just going to work, you know, I'm just going to work with this, generate sounds as audio, and then kind of create these loops or sound beds or, you know, drones, and then I have a whole kind of library of these custom sounds that I archive, that I can then draw to later. But I will generally try to focus on a particular software program or a particular piece of gear, or my modular system, which I like, because there are a lot of possibilities, but it gets me focused on sort of one system, and then I can then just kind of jam with it and play around with it, and then just record it as audio when I get something that I like, and then archive that for later. But yeah, generally I find being very deliberate, first about like what I want to do and where I want to go, right, with this. Like, if it's a tape pieces, records that I'm working on, it's the focus is, okay, this is going to kind of be this lo-fi kind of project, and the DAW is just going to be used, you know, gridless, and we're going to use kind of these 4-track tape recorders as the main sort of source, right? And so we'll do that, and then choose, you know, a synth or two or something to focus on. And I find that, I would say, not just helpful, but really essential, so that I don't get lost in choice. And also that I can kind of dive in and really kind of avoid the, oh, I'm bored with this, like, let's find something else. So I can kind of do that, like, choose what I'm working on, and just dive into it and explore it deeply, like learn about it. There's so much like one thing can do, right? So if I can kind of stay with it and go deeper, generally there'll be something I'll discover that will be surprising about it. And then there's the element of cohesiveness too, which I find generally works much better if I'm actually just working with maybe a few things, or I've been very deliberate about what I want to work with. The project will take on a certain sound because of the constraints that I'm using, as opposed to well, this sort of sounds all over the place because it has a little of this and a little of that, and now nothing's really sort of fitting together. And that being said, sometimes that is what makes that interesting. So you know, it sort of depends on, again, going back to the drawing board, or their very beginning, and being clear about what it is that you're sort of set out to do. And that's why I like to start everything with kind of, I'd say, this like skeleton project outline of intention. And naturally, you know, things are going to kind of, you know, meander a bit, but at least if I have that as like a signpost, you know, I can kind of use that as a guide, where, because I'll naturally get lost and be like, oh, I want to try this on this, and then be like, oh, was that the original intention, you know, and sort of just go back to like, what was the original intention? Because in my experience, I find like there's this constant play of like structure and then drifting, structure and then drifting, and then sort of finding that balance is key. And I think more difficult now so than ever, because it's this double-edged sword where we're in this renaissance time of being blessed by having everything at our disposal, right? You could do the entire thing on a new MacBook, and you're it's endless, and it's accessible. We have all the greatest EQs, the greatest instruments and samples, and you know, it's ridiculous. And then at the same time, it's overwhelming. So yeah, so I would say, like, that's why, again, I just reiterate, like, what am I trying to set out to do?
Yeah, I think for the kind of modern day musician who's sitting in their bedroom and thinking about making some music, really the lack of intent and the lack of commitment to something is really killing a lot of dreams and ambitions, because there's also the problem of you continuously growing and changing, not only as a musician but also as a person. So, you know, if you start an album now, in half a year you might not even want to be making that album anymore. So you also need to kind of commit to something and have a specific intent, and surrender to it and say, you know what, I'm going to put this out no matter what, and then I'm allowed to move onwards. But if you never sort of commit to anything, then things, in theory, there's no end to the postponement of releasing that, and you always obviously get bored with what you're doing, and things become more, what's the word, obvious to you. So you really have to fight that somehow, I find, and I think this is the case for most musicians, really. You have to commit at some point, and especially when you do have this endless world of software and access to this technology, you have to somehow consciously take control of that process, because you know you it's very likely you'll get lost in it otherwise.
Absolutely. I completely agree with that. Yeah.
Well, you kind of touched on some of your kind of creative process, but I get the sense that your creative process in terms of writing music isn't always the same, but maybe, you know, in your own words, what is like a typical creative process for you? Like, is there a lot of kind of variance in how you actually write music, or, you know, what are maybe some of the sets of ways in which you begin writing?
Yeah. It is always a little bit different. Like I said, the very beginning, I like to kind of just think about what are some of the areas that I want to explore, right? So after sort of like setting that out, then the actual sort of musical side of it, right? Once I have sort of these templates and I have sort of a box or an instrument, it's always kind of a discovery process, I guess, for me. It's kind of fiddling around with something, and then finding something, at least the stuff that I find fascinating and that sort of sticks with me, that engages me, is really this process of discovery, and so it's never one thing. It's not like, oh, I just start with a beat, or I just start with like piano chords or something like this. It's really just picking something that I've decided to kind of tinker with, and seeing what comes out of that, and then kind of following that, and seeing where that leads. And one thing that I do a lot of is I do a lot of I'll record just kind of these little pieces and parts, loops, and like I mentioned, sort of these sound beds, and I have this sort of this library of content, and I will go when I'm in the process of actually like making something. I will often go and start to, like, maybe I'll be onto something and I'll say, like, oh, let me check my library for something that I made, and I'll start to match things that I wouldn't necessarily have thought about matching. I find that's when some of the interesting magic happens, is when these sort of two different worlds collide and somehow kind of like work together, because I wasn't thinking of adding that. I was just thinking of, like, jamming with this modular and generating these ideas, and then I'm on the piano, and then suddenly, like, I start to kind of bring in some of those maybe modular elements that I worked on, like, a few months back, and suddenly that's maybe an interesting combination of sorts. But so much of the process for me is really this sense of digging into something, finding some kind of a sound or a texture that is engaging, and that ends up leading me somewhere. And it's very much this malleable thing where it never really, like, it starts off as something and it generally ends up something else. It really rarely like starts off, like, I'll make tracks. Maybe I'll do a full-blown arrangement of something, and until it's really working, I'll sort of dissect it and destroy it and reconfigure it, or come back to it, and often it will go under several iterations, which can be drastically different. I might just take one element from it, but it's really I'd say this iterative process of being led somewhere, and seeing where that goes, and then trying to reinforce whatever that is, whatever that needs. So it goes through these sort of phases. But that, yeah, is that confusing? Or?
No. That's very. At least I think I'm following you. But talking about these libraries of loops that you store up, how far back in time do they go? Like, do you have stuff from the 90s or like, and also how the heck do you catalog all of this? Like, do you have a certain software or system for that? Because I think a lot of musicians might find that kind of a useful method. So maybe you have some technical, practical tips on how you actually sustain that.
Yeah, I think it's very useful, from the standpoint that I find it pretty exhausting to just, like, make, a track. It just entails so much, right? Like, you can spend so much on the sound design, so much on the drum program. There's so many nuances. I mean, that's what makes electronic music so interesting to me, are these details and these nuances and these kind of colliding sounds. And it's not complicated, right? It's like maybe just 3 or 4 different things, but they're just really work well together, and they're really engaging. and they evolve in a very interesting way. So, but that doesn't happen usually on its own so much as it happens through, you know, time and perspective and being able to like piece. And that's where these kind of like this sort of, to me, this library approach is very useful. So I have stuff that goes back, yes, in, you know, dates back to the 90s. Most of that stuff is field recordings, though. Most of the beats that I've made and the kind of drones and other stuff I've thrown away because they're just terrible. But the field recordings I held on to because they're field recordings, and for the most part, you know, they you can find something kind of useful in them. But it's something that I've sort of made this approach where, you know, I try to be as methodical about it as I can, where I'll start the week working on something, and I'll generate, you know, I'll maybe like work on one track a week, and by the end of the week, I'll stop and I'll just export whatever that I like about it in separate folders. So I'll have like maybe I built up like a track of, you know, some interesting modular drum loops, or, you know, I ran, you know, my drum machines through certain effects, and I like the pattern. But I'll make in these edits and make these loops so that they're very accessible later. And then I have a kind of a hierarchy folder of, I have drum loops, and then I have within that I have like modular percussion is one, kind of IDM spastic beats is another, and drum machine beats is another one. So I kind of know what you know, when I'm looking for something, I can kind of quickly go through. I think it's the categories aren't what's important. It's just whatever is relevant to what you're doing. And then the same goes for like melodic components, right? I'll have folders in there that adhere to, you know, maybe like melodic modular loops, or I have one for drones, which I'll basically just focus on creating these evolving drones through synths going through guitar pedals or plugins or whatever I'm kind of interested in exploring to create these drone textures. I'll name the key so that I can kind of quickly access them, so I know, you know, I don't have to like deal with trying to figure out what key they're in. And I find that's very useful because a lot of times, often like a track will be missing something, and then suddenly I'll go for one of these kind of textures, field recordings, or drones, and suddenly it kind of like takes on it brings new life into it, or it will be the missing component that it needed. Or a great example is this track that we were working on. My friend Micah and I were working on for this latest release, our Tape Pieces record, and we were both like, something's sort of missing in the track, it's not working, and going through a library and finding, literally it was just this like looping cassette noise, and that loop somehow ended up gelling with the other components going on, and that that took it to the finish line. Otherwise we'd have like dumped the track. And
but it's one of the most pleasant sounds in the world. It's really like, I've thought about noise so much in the the few past months, because it just breathes this kind of soul into the audio, and like it's a very strange thing. I don't know if you've made any kind of, well, obviously observations, but any kind of deductions or I don't know. Do you have any insights about, you know, or thoughts on why that is? Is it pure nostalgia or what's happening?
Yeah, I think it's the chaos element, and I think that's what makes great music great is there's this beautiful balance between order and chaos. And if the music is too ordered, it's uninteresting. If the music is total free and chaos, it's unlistenable unless you're really into that stuff, you know. You know, I'm not dissing noise music because but you know, to me, like that, it's a striking balance. I mean, again, going back to Bach, even in his music, there's that beautiful balance of tension and release, of chaos and order, and this sort of push and pull. And I think noise serves that purpose in music for sure. And it provides sort of that element of discomfort, but in an interesting and engaging way. So yeah, so those are, I think those are to me examples of why I end up kind of building up this library. And yeah, and in terms of structuring it, I really I've sort of restructured it, and I've played with different you know, variations of how I do that. But essentially, it's divided into drum loops, drones, melodic components, sampled components is like a whole nother folder of like, I'll just sample stuff off vinyl, create a loop, and then name it and archive it. If anything's done to a BPM, I always try and reference the BPM, because then it's just, again, very useful to go on. But grabbing like a tambourine loop from something I sampled off of vinyl might be the missing percussion that I need on this track. And suddenly those two components just come together. So I find a lot of sort of, you know, say auspicious coincidence when I bring these two different things together and then they form something interesting. And that would never have happened if I didn't have this library of original content. And so that's a big part of my process, and organizing that is key, because obviously, you know, you want to be able to like quickly find what you're looking for. And then I have a bunch of one shots where and I'll maybe make drum kits and stuff like that out of those. And again, those are also categorized according to the type of world that they inherit. So it might be like object-based percussion of, you know, stuff that objects I've recorded, like any, you know, dice or keys or little stuff. And I'll take little components like that, chop them up and make drum kits out of them. Or sample my own instruments and create like these little sample instruments out of them.
Cool.
But yeah, essentially, yeah, those are sort of I'd say the main categories.
Yeah, cool. By the way, if you hear any running water noises coming from here, there's an actual sauna above me, and I think someone's in there. So,
and
yeah, I mean, just above the studio, there's a sauna. So that's okay. That's very Finnish. If
nice.
Nothing
so
else.
Go to the sauna after a hard day's work in the studio.
Usually, yeah. That's it's, you know, if you're Finn, that just is a part of your life. Like I don't think you can be Finnish if you don't sauna.
Is that right? Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is truly a Finnish invention. I mean, I don't think there's any debate about that. But yeah, I mean, it's I don't know what the numbers are, but it's like there are, I should probably Google this, but there are ridiculous amounts of the number of saunas in relation to the population is absolutely stupid. It's worth Googling, but yeah, I mean, it's in our blood. Like, that's just a part of our culture, very strong part. So if you ever visit, yeah, we should definitely hit the sauna. And if it's winter, then you have to jump into the snow and do all of that, or swim in the sea.
Did you do hot springs in Finland?
No, we don't have hot springs. Like not natural ones. No, so we have to heat them up.
Like, do they do that? Like hot baths, like public baths, Is that part of the culture?
Yeah, I think it's maybe the most common thing is to, like, we have a lot of cabins here, like summer cottages or summer cabins or those kind of things. But you can spend the winter there as well. Not the whole winter, but you can go there with your friends. And we have a lot of cabins here which usually have a sauna. Basically, if it doesn't have a sauna, then it's not a cabin worth even thinking about. But the most common thing is to go to the sauna and then you step outside and you maybe roll around in the snow. And some people have kind of small, not pools, but kind of like big things where you can go sit in the water, and it's ice cold. And some people warm them up, but that's not very common. In fact, I'd say that's probably considered to be kind of like a wussy move. so usually you go into the snow or into the icy water, and then you go back to the sauna because that's super warm. So yeah.
Wow. I need to work up to that, but I believe that it's good for you.
It is. Yeah. But tiny steps. First time you just step outside and maybe walk in the snow a bit, but it's not too bad. Like, obviously the biggest part of it is mental. But yeah, I mean, every time if you go to cold water, it doesn't feel great to get in there, but afterwards it's amazing. So yeah, that's a big part of the culture. But going back to the music, I think this is a good point to go into your kind of mixing process, because to me I mean, first of all, your mixes sound amazing to me, and to me, based on what I've learned about your process and what I know from our previous discussions, it seems to me like you achieve that sound based on how much work you put into sound selection as well as arrangement. So well, first of all, do you find that to be correct? And how does that relate to the mixing process, and what is your mixing process actually like? Like you mentioned, you're not super technical, but yet you achieve these mixes that sound amazing to me. So I'd really love to understand kind of your whole view on this on this area, and what is your mixing process actually like?
Sure. Well, to your point about sound selection and arrangement, I would pinpoint that as like first and foremost as foundational to the mixing process, because I'm very much an advocate of if sounds aren't sounding good together, I won't even bother trying to mix them. I'll just choose another sound, or I'll get rid of it, or some. So really, the arrangement and sound selection is fundamentally important. So I found whenever I try to like get things to work together by EQing this and that and compress, it just ends up like more annoying than it started. And maybe something works on its own, but it doesn't work together. So I just have to get rid of it. So that's foundational. Then, in terms of technical, I think the technical I was referring to is because the mixes are very technical, in that there's a lot of automation going on. And my technical thing that is it's more of like understanding technical things. I'm sort of slow with, but when it comes to the mixing, they are technical in the sense that there generally are there's a lot of automation going on. There's a lot of things happening in dynamic things happening in the mix. In terms of the mix process, I don't, in terms of the tools in the process, I'm really relying mostly on EQ. I would say 90% EQ and very little compression, really. I will bus everything to sort of their own group, but most of sort of the sound sculpture and getting the sound to the point is done in both the sound creation process and the sound sculpture process. And then I EQ everything. So EQ is really like my main tool for getting everything to have its own place in the mix. And so I'm pretty aggressive with EQ cutting, and I will cut most of the bass on anything that's really not bass, fairly severely. So I'll use pretty steep slopes for that, and because I really like mixes where you feel each component. So I want the bass to just fully embody the bass part of the spectrum, and I don't want to hear any. I don't like hearing overlapping elements. And I'll use I EQ all the effects. I'll record all the effects as audio. And EQ them as well, because I find there's a lot of mixes that don't sound good. Is just there's so much muddy buildup, and a lot of that happens. A lot of it happens from effects that are sort of neglected, I feel like. So I like to record everything as audio and EQ everything. I think that's a big part of my process. And I rarely will boost anything when I EQ it. It's mostly just kind of cutting the parts that aren't working and that's rolling off the low end, or if there's some like resonances that poke out, I'll pull those down in the parametric EQ. And I use the Fab Filter stuff is just amazing for that. So that's pretty much, that's like I say, EQ is the main tool. And then there's there's generally a lot of automation happening, and that's I try and get things working together in small groups first. So I'll often just kind of work with the drums together. I don't find it useful to just solo one sound, because then you have nothing to really reference it towards. So to me, like my mix process is generally not totally separate from like the track creation process. I'll kind of sculpt it as I go, but then once I reach the end and I feel like I want to take it to the release line, I will then have sort of a separate mix process where I'll dedicate time to just kind of enhancing everything and fine tuning everything. And so that I'll generally work with instrument groups. So I'll kind of get the kick happening with the rest of the drum elements, get the kick and the bass working together.
I was gonna ask, do you have any kind of tips or what's your process when you're trying to get the percussive elements, the low percussive, like a kick, to work with the bass? Obviously, again, sound selection is a big part of it, but do you have any kind of general tips on how to make them sit in the mix?
That's the hardest, for sure, and it's it always ends up being some kind of a sacrifice. One wins over the other. You can't have both, unfortunately. There are times when I find if I widen the bass, and I'm a big fan of so for these kind of big sustained bass sounds, which I love, I'll use the Sound Toys plugin, the micro shifter. They have the little micro shifter. I think that's a free one, but it basically doubles the sound and detunes the other one and creates this really nice, rich, wide sound. So if I have a bass that I can create a very wide bass, then the mono kick, and the kick is in mono, I find that actually that helps, because the kick will sort of they're not going to be conflicting one another. I mean, they still may be, but if something is super wide and something's in the middle, like the kick is in the middle, then that tends to work better. All my kicks will always be in mono. All my drums are generally always in mono. So I find like having everything in mono is great. So just reserving very specific things to stereo, so they stand out is a helpful mix tip. Because when too many things are in stereo, it just ends up like being like mush, because everything is just super wide and nothing really stands out anymore. So I generally try and work with the process of like, since everything I record in mono, and then just reserve stereo for very specific, kind of treating it like a special effect. That being said, I will pan things to kind of create their own, spaces. But and then the other thing is I try to create a dynamic mix where things are evolving and changing, and that's volume, and EQ. It's really not that complicated, but that's a huge component of it. So I will automate the low end of the EQ to be enhanced in maybe different sections of the track, depending on when it's more appropriate for that to build a certain element of tension. And I even found sort of like rolling off the high end and then slowly bringing the high end off of, say, like maybe there's a drone that goes throughout this track and it starts with the high end pretty much rolled off, and then slowly starts to gradually fade in through as the track evolves, so that there's a sense that the track is growing in intensity, if that's sort of what I was after. So that's something I'll do a lot, is I'll automate the EQ on individual tracks or groups of tracks, depending on the effect that I want to go for, not just volume, but EQs. And I'll also reference, I'll generally reference a few tracks that I feel like are kind of in the same or similar sonic space. And I'll try as best I can to kind of dissect what they're doing. And how they're achieving what they're doing. And I don't think, again, I don't think it's like this total top secret. I think it's really a combination of clever layering and EQ and this understanding of foreground and background, which is also very important in the context of a mix. What's super close and upfront, and thinking about your mix in a three-dimensional space, right? So that you have this sense of contrast and variety, right? So like if you're out, I was like outside listening to the rain the other day, and it was like immediately just like these very crisp upfront raindrops, and then a little further back is this wind, and then even further back is this sort of siren that's sort of dying around in the distance. But thinking about my mixes like that is I find very helpful. Like what do I want? What's kind of the main attention grabbing thing that I want to focus on, and then how does that? How do the rest of those components support it and contrast it? And then how do they and then do they evolve? I think that's a thing, because mixes that don't evolve are, even if it's repeating the same thing, if it's actually like changing subtly, like thinking like that can really make a big difference, I think, in how one perceives a mix, even though you're not going to notice that. And that could be like putting a flanger on a hi-hat and with a really slow rate. So it's just every time that same hi-hat repeats, it's sort of in a sonic, different space. It's just a little bit different every time. So I try to add, I think of sort of effects like that. And yeah, reverb is a huge component in mixes, in my mixes, where I'll generally take take a track, run it through some crazy reverb, and I like to automate and evolve the reverb. So in both maybe the decay time or some parameters of the reverb, and then because I like mixes that are very I want to say sculpted. I find those very satisfying. I like to record all those effects as audio, and then I can in audio take them out by just cutting them, right, editing them out for selections. So you have these very kind of discrete cuts where maybe a kick drum happens and then the reverb's in the background, and the next time the reverb is completely gone and shuts off. Whereas it's maybe not as fast if you do that in automation, So and you have a little more fine-tuned control over effects. But yeah, a lot of it comes down to layering. Layering's just such a large part of that is kind of finding the components that gel well together, and seeing what's forefront, what's background, and what's complementing and what's contrasting.
Yeah. I think you're really I'd say at a master level of kind of handling those, because these are kind of the fundamentals of mixing, yet they are an arrangement especially as you think about it as a mixing meeting arrangement kind of a way, but they're really kind of basic things. But the more you talk with actual professionals in the field, the more you hear the two words of volume and EQ. And I think if people want to hear, obviously there are probably many other tracks that you've made that brilliantly kind of serve as master classes in how to do that. But certainly you made the remix of Napoleon, the Symbian project track, which I love that remix. It's a wonderful track. But I'm sure there are many others where you utilize the kind of the same principle. But I think that track is good because it is this kind of continuous growth towards the end. And I think people can sort of practically hear quite a bit of that in there.
Right.
Right. A couple of things about mixing specifics. First of all, you mentioned reverb as a big part. Do you use a lot of mono reverbs, or are they most of the time stereo, and what kind of what actual specific reverbs do you tend to use?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I like both. If it's a mono reverb, I really like panning the mono reverb in one speaker and panning the dry in the other. And sometimes that works really cool because it's you have an echo or a mushed out version of one in one speaker, and then the dry version of the other, and then it sort of makes a new sound that way. So that I'll use a mono verb in the middle, and it just has a very specific kind of lo-fi, early sound. I'm a big fan of that too. I love spring reverbs, so I tend to gravitate towards spring reverbs, and I will use, I'm fortunate to have an ARP, which if I'm not feeling lazy, I will run equipment through there just to use its spring reverb. That being said, spring reverb plugins are abound, and they all sound incredible now. But I will use the Big Sky reverb, and their spring reverb sounds great too.
What's the best software spring reverb? Because I like the sound, but I'm still struggling to find a good software spring reverb.
So Altiverb has everything, and they have the ARP string reverb in there, which you can run stuff through. What's a good software spring reverb? Yeah. Because I use more, I guess for the spring reverb, I use more of the pedals. But okay. Sorry. No, the UAD, what's it? The box. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, that's the one I have, and that's the best I've heard. It's really kind of it's very smooth. for
Yeah, very.
yeah.
Yeah, and you the varieties, and so you can change the. I think one's darker than the other, but actually that's my go-to. I would say for the stream
Yeah.
reverb, like on my templates, like more of the stream reverbs I end up using are that, unless I'm really like, want to go nuts and run, stuff through the art. But yeah, that's a fantastic stream reverb. Yeah.
Is it BX20 or
BX20? Yeah, and there's other emulations, not just UAD makes it. But I think really, I mean, there's probably free ones which are great. I don't think it's a complicated thing, these stream reverbs. So another reverb that's excellent, which is really very, on the other end of the spectrum, and I think it's free, it's called Raum, Araum. It's a Native Instruments plugin, and that's fantastic for like kind of these big, gigantic reverb, which really they can kind of end up being their own instrument in and of itself, because they transform whatever you put into it so drastically. But that's fantastic for these really big evolving reverbs, and they have you have a modulation on there, and it's a very beautiful modulation, which kind of creates this sort of almost like I don't know, like this sort of not tremolo, like this kind of like flickering sort of sonic quality, and that actually has a semblance of a pitch to it, and automating reverb. So you can do all kinds of crazy stuff now with in Ableton, they have built-in LFOs and whatnot, and I find that like using those in tandem with your reverb plugins is really fantastic for creating kind of these dynamic evolving reverbs. So I'll often do that, where I'll use some of the modulation sources like LFOs with particular plugins, and particularly for the reverb. So the Raum is a great, amazing reverb. It's one of my go-tos, and then the Valhalla reverb is incredible too for software. For the same reason as the Raum reverb, just enormous, evolving, really kind of being able to transform things, very smooth, and the parameters sound great when when they're adjusted. You get some really cool results from those. And then I love expensive reverbs, so the Reverb Pedals, going like I kind of got burnt out with the Big Sky because it just like I used it so much, but it is pretty fantastic. And the Otto BAM reverb is incredible. Again, I'm a big fan of reverbs from the early 80s, and that's sort of this box that sort of simulates that. The CXM 1978 by
Chase Bliss.
Yeah, that's a on the high end of reverbs, But again, the plugins out there, the Valhalla, all the Valhalla stuff, which I think is, there are a bunch of free stuff there too. Those are like Wiley's, and those sound amazing.
Yeah. Lastly, on mixing, you mentioned bus compression. Any sort of typical ones you use there? Maybe a few mentions.
Yeah, so I do some sidechain compression, and I use the glue compressor for that. So that would be maybe another very known, overly known technique for working with kicks and bass. And I try to use that judiciously, because it is so, it's like it's so much the go-to thing to do. But that's a great compressor, actually, and it's built right into Ableton. I think they have the glue compressor. Cytonic makes it as a plugin, which you can buy for very little, I think, as an AU plugin if you use other DAWs. So I'll use that, but pretty lightly. If I'm going to compress an entire group, I'm always afraid. Like I like the way, if I like the way it sounds, I don't want to fuck it up, you know? So I'm like, the only time I'll do that is if I really, I want to bring everything up by a bit. So, I'll generally, I won't use a compressor that's going to color it very much. So the compressors I found, and that's a problem I found with using compression, is it just ends up like coloring the sound way too much, and then suddenly it's not at all. It's not like I want it to be in these cases. I want it to be I want it to be more technical. So the ones that I found that worked well for that, the glue compressor actually does work well for that. The other one that works well, is the C2 compressor from FabFilter. Those, that tends to be more transparent, and so maybe if I have like, you know, a group of drones and I kind of want them to gel a little bit, you know, I'll add a little bit of compression, but generally pretty judiciously. And if I don't like to do it on drums so much, because that sort of starts to like smash the transients. So if I do, then it'll be pretty subtle. But generally I don't.
Yeah, cool.
It would be a version that it's not going to like, I'm not going to notice a big difference, for example. But yeah, these other plugin, you know, other compression plugins and like the, you know, UAD stuff, they have all those like 1176 and all that stuff sounds cool, but it's really like it's going to really color, and if that's what you're after, then that's great.
Yeah. Kind of this is again like me having a guess about your process, but like you're putting all this effort to find the right sounds and put them together to make this effective arrangement. It kind of sounds to me like there might be a lot of kind of patience involved in that process. So is that something that is that like a correct observation, and how do you support that patience? Like how do you make sure that you maintain that focus throughout the process? Because a lot of the time, well, perhaps not a lot of the time, but some of the time, you know, things might not be kind of working your way. So, you know, if that's the case, how do you kind of make sure you stay the course and focus on the right things and not make, you know, jumpy decisions or mistakes?
Yeah, no, patience is definitely a key component of the whole thing. And I think I've maybe I want to say resigned to the to the understanding at this point, or at least I have a better relationship with it, that often things don't work, and either letting them go, or certainly not trying to force them to work. And I think that's especially painful when something starts off and is really exciting, and you feel like you're onto something, and it's just, then you hit a wall, you know, and then it's like nothing is really happening, and you're trying this and that, and then frustration starts to kick in, and it's like this exponential, you know, like slope of like I went from liking this to like now I'm not sure, and now I hate it, you know. But I try to, in those situations, you know, I think with the patients, oftentimes it's putting it down and coming back to it, you know, and just allowing it to be what it is. So that might be like, well, this is what this track is, you know, and that's what, and I don't have to put it out, you know, but that I'll see it through to a certain point, and then at a certain point I let it go and move on to something else. But I do have this sort of salvageable mentality where it's like, well, I want to salvage something out of it, and that's where it's like I'll try to take components and then export those as these loops, which, you know, could then get used for something else later. So nothing ever gets completely wasted, really. And then the other yeah, so I think it's really to me this notion of yes, things take time, and sometimes they need time for these connections to happen that just aren't going to happen when working on something linearly. So it's often coming back to them at another point in time, and then hearing it in a very different way and connecting it to something else that then, something is birthed. So just realizing that that's sort of the nature of it, right? Yeah, and then just realizing a lot of this stuff doesn't work. So if I'm just working on one thing, that's kind of going to be a lot of wasted energy. Whereas if I kind of can set, I try and sort of set the week where I'll work on one thing, and then the next week I'll work on something else, and the next week I'll work on something else. So every week I don't try to work on one thing for more than a week. If that makes sense. So I think that's also part of, like, yes, it's patience, but it's also kind of a work process of not investing all my effort into trying to make something work. Because generally, in my experience, if I'm working on something, the more I work on it, the worse it's going to be. After a while, and I'm talking about this in like a very linear fashion, like every day plugging away at it, it's not going to get better. So I'll just get it to a point where, I'm out of ideas, or it's just, I can't feel like I can take it anymore. And then I'll work on something else. And then I'll go through like kind of a revisitation process where I'll go back to what I did, and I, archive all of these ideas as like, rough mixes. And at that point, there's always something that happens. There's always something that I'll hear that I didn't hear when I was sort of in the thick of it. And it's very informative. And I try to listen to it like in the car, or, out of the context of the studio, which I find very helpful too. And then it's like I either want to like revisit that and try and work on it more and maybe do something different with it, or let it go.
Yeah. Well, it sounds like, well, again, here we see the theme of restriction, because, and I think that's a massively difficult lesson for a lot of musicians and creatives, period, to learn to manage their time in relation to their work. Was that something has that come to you naturally, or is it something you've learned over the years to kind of restrict how much time you can spend on something, and also introduce this kind of cyclical process that allows you to, experience sufficient change and momentum, and then, come back to things? Is it something that was natural, or did you learn to do that over the years?
Yeah, I had to learn to do it over the years, very, very much so. I think the natural thing was, to me, was to just keep on plugging away at it, and with this striving, like, oh, I'm almost there. I'm almost going to arrive, and really realizing that, no, that's I'm up against this illusion. So I had to create, I had to find methods to that I think were for my sanity, that were just more effective and for the long run of it, because it really is. It's like you go in, you put some effort in, you see what comes out, and it's a process, and it's not all going to be great, and it's not all supposed to be great. But if you by the end of the year, if you've done that, you'll have something.
Yeah, I think that's.
You shouldn't. It shouldn't be if you're liking everything that you do on a daily basis, something's wrong. Yep. You have no critical ear at that point. So. And that's, I think that's the other tough side of it, is that you're up against your own critique, and that can, it's necessary, but at the same time it can also be debilitating, so that there's a relationship with your inner critique that you need to balance.
Yeah, I think that's some of the best advice that a lot of creatives can really get, because it's that management. It's all like having creativity and having inspiration is one thing, but how to transmutate that into something actual requires a lot of practical processes to support that. But maybe it's time to get a bit kind of synth nerdy here, I guess, for the lack of a better word. First of all, what was your first synth?
Okay, so my first official synth, I'm gonna forego the like, I don't know, Radio Shack keyboard, because I don't think that was actually really a synth. But that you had like 5 little tracks that record stuff on. But my first synth was a 01W workstation from Korg, and that was it was like probably 94. Yeah. It wasn't real. It was a synth, but it was more of a workstation. I thought it was a synth, and you couldn't really like easily program sounds on it. It was all like menu, and you had to like I would adjust stuff. But that was I thought it was amazing, and I could start record. I had a sequencer in it, and I that was like what I first used to start making my tracks on.
Do you still have that around, or?
No, that's long. Yeah. If I don't think I would ever use that. It was a pretty disappointing. It sort of took everything. It was an interesting time in that world of synths, because it was going out of like the 80s, where like analog synths were with all the knobs. They're moving away from that in favor of practical workstations where you can load hundreds of sounds and record them easily, but they're all crappy sounding, and you're not supposed to adjust the filter because the filter sounds like crap. So but practically that's what that's around the time that when I wanted a synth, that's what was out, and I didn't know any better, but I loved it because I could make my own stuff, but I was always kind of like, everything, it sounds like a little cheap.
Yeah. Okay, next question. This probably isn't. I asked this from Casson as well, and it's kind of like, I don't know. Maybe there's an easy answer for you, but there might not be. What's your favorite synth and why?
Okay, well that I can tell you. So SH-101, I named my license plate after it, and the reason is it's first off it's a magic little synth. It's a magic little synth. Yeah, it's so I'm a big fan of simplicity, and it's a very simple mono synth. You have 2 oscillators and a sub oscillator. There's a little built-in step record sequencer there, but it sounds incredible. You have basic modulation, but there's noise as a modulation source, and the noise modulation source on the oscillators or on the filter just has this kind of raw analog chaos to the sound, and it just always, it sounds great in a mix. It sounds it's just an incredible sounding and fun synth to use and play. And I'll start maybe like a little sequence on the built-in step sequencer, just pluck some notes and then trigger the sequence, and immediately like there's like something evocative that comes out of that. But that's kind of my go-to. It's just super quick and sounds awesome. And I think it was a keytar, which is I don't know, pretty nerdy in and of itself.
Oh wait, where is it? Here.
Oh, there you go. Yeah.
Pretty nerdy. Yeah.
Yeah.
Did the well, I mean, first of all, it is a classic synth for a reason, but did all of the models have the keytar end, or was it only on some of them? Because I thought like you had two different versions of.
I think all the SH series did. They came in different colors. They had like the blue, red, and gray were the main colors. So I have the gray one. But I think they were all keytars.
Yeah, cool. Lastly, touching on like, do you have a favorite form of synthesis, or is that like, do you think all of them have their place in time, or is there something specifically about, subtractive synthesis or FM that speaks to you, or do you have any sort of general thoughts on synthesis types?
Yeah, I mean, my kind of go-to is subtractive synthesis. Analog subtractive synthesis has always been what has excited me in terms of the sound the most, and I think that's what maybe I was most disappointed in with my first synth, that it was a digital thing. And I remember like going to some shop or whatever and seeing like it used this analog synth, and I have no idea like how to use it, but it immediately was like, oh wow, that's a synth, like that's what it's supposed to be. Just this raw analog power and sculpting it. So, and that's what I think I got good at by just investing in doing out of just the love of these sounds and the components of it, and certainly the most familiar I am with it. That being said, FM synthesis and granular synthesis are super exciting, and wavetable synthesis I find really intriguing too. The notion of cycling through and modulating wavetables and being able to like load anything from like waveforms or samples, and you get some very, very different kind of synthesis effects. And the granular synthesis for processing is maybe one of my favorites. Certainly for like kind of these evolving textural beds and interesting noises. And I love the idea of sort of the science of splitting a sound into all these atomic components and rearranging them and stretching them. So I'm a big fan of granular synthesis for sure. But yeah, certainly like analog subtractive synthesis is what I end up kind of using the most.
Yeah, I guess maybe the next one, because this is kind of really been on my mind for the past couple of years, is creative life meeting sort of normal life, I guess. Life balance in terms of creativity meeting all the other responsibilities of life, and especially having kids, because you have kids or a kid, I guess.
Yeah.
Yes, a kid. And sorry, could you say that again?
I say it feels sometimes like I have more than one, just because there's a lot going on.
Yeah, multiple ones packed in one. Yeah. Now I want to have kids one day, and I'm sure that some of the people listening to this want to do so as well. And creatives are pretty notorious for struggling to find like a normal life balance, and sort of wanted to maybe explore some of the experiences that you've had in terms of that. Like, has that been a challenge for you, or has it come naturally? And if there have been any challenges, what were they, and how have you managed to sort of achieve a better balance with that, or how do you continue to do that?
Yeah. No, that's a great question. And it didn't come naturally to me, and it has been challenging. Um, so yeah, I think, it's I mean, specifically, parent, parent, right? Requires responsibilities and time management, and, just all this, all these added responsibilities that, you know, we're not so used to, or right, we don't have beforehand. So, um, from that angle alone, and I think, and then, if you want to address, non-parenthood, but just in general, the balance of, life and doing this can be tricky, and is certainly doable, but just requires scheduling. It requires a lot of scheduling and time management. Like we said at the beginning, which unfortunately, it doesn't come natural. So it required, to me, like some retraining or training in those areas, and trial and error and seeing what works. But yeah, certainly, with addressing like parenthood and fatherhood, it's first and foremost, it's been amazing, and it's been such an added source of joy in my life. As much as it's a pain in the ass in areas, it's first and foremost, far more meaningful than really anything, and has added a lot of enrichment to my creative life, for sure. So all that outweighs it, and to me, it just required, it's a learning curve, and like anything in balance, I think that the tricky thing with doing music or any art is that it sort of takes over. There's this sort of like manic component to it, where it's a little bit obsessive, and that can manifest in different degrees. But if you're not really balanced, or you're not balancing it, it's always like, 90% of your energy is going into that. You only have 100%, right? You don't have more than 100%. So, there's something's gonna be out of balance, and if you have these other responsibilities in your life, right, you're not going to be able to show up for them in effective ways, and then that's when all kinds of conflicts and problems start occurring. So for me, it was kind of a slow acclimation process, and a process of somewhat realizing I'm kind of fighting myself, because I'm up against this illusion of, and I think maybe anyone in this sort of productivity world of, like, when they think they always have to be doing something to be productive, that's actually a misguided notion, that actually resting and not inaction is actually an important component, in my experience. So it took some introspective practices to I think get to certain points for me where it was apparent that, like, oh, you know what, I'm really kind of up against myself a lot in this, and actually by living a more balanced life, I maybe have less time, right, to do music, but I'm actually using it in a more engaged way, and I'm not necessarily getting less done, right? And I'm actually, like, by offsetting the amount of time that I get to spend, making music and working on in these sort of creative areas, I'm actually more enriched because of sort of really sort of this mind frame shift of seeing not balance is not something that's taking away from something, but actually that's actually adding to it. by contrasting and enriching it in ways. And so I think that was sort of a helpful mind shift. I think on sort of intuitively, I kind of knew that on a certain level. But I think there, like I said, you know, in my experience, there is this sort of like mania of momentum that when you're wrapped up in something, and particularly, you know, and this is an unfortunate side effect of maybe the social media culture that we live in, that you're seeing like, oh, this person's doing this and this and that, and, you know, getting kind of wrapped up in this notion of, which is completely illusory in and of itself, because we actually have no real tangible idea what, you know, what their life is like. That, you know, I would get wrapped up in this sort of like productivity, war, right? Where I felt like I wouldn't, you know, I wasn't being able to get done what I needed to get done. So, so for me, it was really like, this kind of mind shift, I'd say, looking away, that was, I found very helpful from this notion of extra productivity means, you know, I will be more successful, and realizing that there's a lot of flaws in that, and that's illusory, and that's actually really not the case, and kind of bringing a more varied balance to my life. I found that very helpful. And then the practical side of it was really just building and structuring routines and balancing, right? So if I have a structure to my week, so I know I have X amount of time to do this, and then I have these responsibilities. I'm taking my kid to school, I'm picking him up on these days. It just it makes it easier. So I found that, like, you know, creating schedules and creating, you know, these kind of responsibilities and commitments was also very helpful in just facilitating and kind of dividing those two. And ultimately, it was enriching, because when I have time to do this and I am able to immerse myself in it, then I'm able to be present with my kid, and I give him my full attention, or I try to. And if I'm not, he knows that, and, you know, he's going to call me on that, right? And I mean, it doesn't matter. Basically, you're at the whim of him at that point anyway, you know. So yeah, I found it really helpful to be able to, again, just kind of bring my attention into whatever it was that I was engaged in, and that was actually not only enriching but energizing. Yeah. So I would actually, as opposed to, let me just get this done, you know, so that I can get to what I really want to do. And then when I'm getting to what I really want to do, I actually end up being frustrated because I'm not doing what I thought I wanted to do. So by just simply kind of committing to being engaged in whatever the activity that I was doing, as opposed to trying to kind of, like, you know, sneak off and do some emails, you know, like, and then not really ever really doing it. And you know, I found that like a much more kind of scattered way. It's kind of the opposite of multitasking approach, where just to whatever the responsibility was at the time, to be to try to be present and engaged with it. And yeah, does that make sense?
I think that makes complete sense, and I think a lot of creatives have this problem where they have, you know, a lot of free time in their hands, and they very consciously want to keep it that way, because for them, loss of opportunity, loss of potential is like, it can be like sucking the life force out of them. Like, the loss of that openness and opportunity and potential is kind of anxiety inducing. Whereas,
Sure.
yeah, whereas what you're describing is, again, creating restrictions so that you can actually be more effective at the things that you want to be doing. And I think that's really, in a world where you have infinite potential, infinite openness, infinite opportunity, again, it becomes infinite chaos. And you need to create some sort of boundaries so that you can actually create something actual. So yeah, I think that's great advice.
And the other component of it is I'm convinced that human beings just need variety. I'm very convinced of this now, that I would be far worse off if I just got to do whatever I wanted to do 24/7. That I would probably most definitely be spinning my wheels and probably more frustrated about it. And there's this sense of like, now there's a sense of like, okay, there's a sense of appreciation, like, okay, I get to do this now. And after about 3 hours of being in the studio, I'm kind of done anyway, you know, like I'm not gonna like, at that point, if I've worked on something for a sort of 3 hour chunks, you know, I find that like a good sort of time window. I'm not saying to like make, you know, a full track in that amount of time, but to just get something. And after that, it starts to not be as good.
Yeah.
So good stopping point. And then again, to just, it's all about sort of like it's like we invest, we burn out a little bit, and then we need to get invigorated, you know? So I think having that variety is really energizing, and it's what keeps things, it's ultimately, I think, what keeps ideas flowing. You know, we talked about inspiration, and me just sitting in the studio is not inspiration. You know, inspiration is outside of the studio, for the most part. I mean, it is inspiring to work with instruments for sure, and there's a lot of fun in that. But most of the ideas are sort of, I'm convinced, are subconsciously informed by these you know, outer life experience.
Yeah. It's what was I going to say? Well, yeah, I mean, I fully kind of agree with just about everything you said. If you think about sort of how your overall life balance affects your creativity, because it's this very common idea that, you know, a lot of great art, or a lot of art is made from suffering. So, you know, you can be inspired by the chaos and the turmoil in your life. But, you know, I do find that to be true. But at the same time, like, I might be inspired by that, but as a whole, as a human being, as this sort of holistic entity, I feel worse off. Like, I can be tremendously inspired to write a lot of stuff when I'm in a dark place, but as a whole, that's a more of a negative for me, all things considered. And I wonder whether you have some thoughts on that. And I certainly these days struggle to be creative if I know that my personal life isn't in a good balance. So I need to really take care of my immediate, most important relationships before I can think about just about anything else. So maybe you have some thoughts on that and how it is for you.
Yeah, no, I think for me, like the fundamental creation process is fueled by being in a good headspace. Now, good doesn't necessarily mean like, you know, jovial and like, but it certainly does mean like mentally well. So, you know, being, you know, consumed by, you know, particularly like hostile emotions, I find completely impossible to write music. And for example, if I'm consumed, you know, if there's anger, or there's, you know, intense sadness and depression, where you know, it might be an appropriate outlet, but to be consumed by that mentally is a huge drain, and not not energizing. So yeah, I'm a big proponent of taking care of myself physically and mentally so that I'm in the best possible headspace to work on music. And that's and that there's sort of like a maintenance process there. And again, good doesn't mean, being happy, but it's really just being in a space of working with things as they are, and that's incredibly important. I cannot identify with this sort of like, I need to be in a mentally, afflicted position to me. That's just so draining and certainly not sustainable. I understand the notion of pain of art can be born out of painful situations, but I think that even that comes with an insight which leads to a meaning coming out of that. So I think maybe in Beethoven's case, right, like there is great pain, but his art, I think, is his way of relating to that in a meaningful way. And that's very different than saying, I'm suffering and I'm just in pain. And I think there's a big delineation between suffering and pain, and then your relation to that suffering and pain. That's a major shift.
Yeah. You mentioned like taking care of yourself,
Yeah.
in both in mind and in body or spirit or body. Anyway, what are some of the practical things that you do on maybe the kind of the more, what could be the mental front as well, but I'm maybe more interested in learning about like the physical stuff. Like, does it come in the form of exercise, or is it in the form of nutrition or sleep, or like how do you make sure you stay optimized for creativity and also, well, general health?
Well, certainly, yeah, sleeping is huge. So I try to maintain a pretty regular schedule of going to bed at the same time. I'm a pretty like early to sleep these days, between 10:30 and 11. So I try as much as possible to maintain a very regular sleep schedule. I generally eat well. That's also kind of because I enjoy cooking and I like food. So I'm sort of invested in that. So I do a lot of yoga as kind of like my regular exercise, and take walks. And then I have a daily meditation practice, which I find super foundational, I'd say, for the day ahead.
Yeah. So you do that first thing in the morning, or?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. That seems to be a pretty common strategy to kind of align your perspective and set your goals and focuses for the day.
Yeah.
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 Cool. Well, there's a bunch of maybe I'll go to kind of the general topic of maybe kind of reflecting back on what you've done on your non-career musical journey so far.
Yeah.
Looking back, like, what do you think is the thing that you've done best so far? It could be, I mean, you can take it anywhere you want. Could be like a single, or like not a single in terms of a single release, but like single track, an album. Could be something specific, or it could be like a mindset thing, or a process kind of a thing. Like, what is the thing you think you've done best so far?
Well, I like that you've divided those up. I mean, in terms of mental and process, I think to me, it's kind of coming to terms and a certain acceptance that, I'm making what I'm making is where I'm at, and it's authentic for that, and I'm doing the best I can with the circumstances, and I've learned to really appreciate that. You know, I think it's again, in my experience of living in this very kind of competitive world, in this sense of always trying to arrive somewhere, and you know, there's always someone kind of over, you know, your head who's maybe doing something you like better, or and so to me, that relationship with myself of just, you know, I think it's been extremely helpful in you know, in one, just appreciating, you know, what I can do, and to kind of push me as further, is really looking at this as like, this is a lifelong thing. You know, I would like to keep on making music until, you know, the end. You know, like this is a lifelong exploration, and to find that there's still joy in this. There's still joy and satisfaction in both discovering new music, and both in, you know, fiddling around with something new, and creating. So that mindset has been very helpful. In terms of like the actual work, you know, I think I'm pretty happy with the Three Spheres record, which I just put out, the Kodomo release, as a whole. Feel pretty more satisfied with that one than much of my other work. And yeah, I'd say one of the tracks that I'm maybe most proud of is Storm King, which is actually the one that you worked on. You lend your fantastic vocals too. And often I'll judge that by going back and listening to tracks, and generally cringing a little bit and hearing like, why was I into that, or why was into that sound? But listening back to Storm King, I always feel very like I landed something that felt authentic, and was at a craftsmanship level that felt like consistent and high level to me, that felt like still holds. So like that track, I would say like maybe that's one of the tracks I'm, maybe if I had to pick, as like most proud of.
Yeah, that's a stunning piece. People should go and listen to it. And you know, it's one of those that I obviously I had only a small part in the track, only, you know, doing a bunch of ambient vocal things, and then you actually made it sound you know, appropriate and good for the track. So I just provided you with a bunch of material, and
but it wouldn't have happened. It wouldn't have happened. So
yeah, I mean,
it's fantastic, you know. So yeah, it was very it's very important to the life of that track.
Yeah, and it's important to give credit where it's due, because it is like an interactive process, and you bounce off other ideas. But yeah, I mean, I you know, in terms of like, if people ask me what I've done with other people, I guide them there, because that's it's just a stunning piece through and through. And I'm really happy and proud that I could be a part of that. So that's super cool.
Well, likewise, Markus. It's yeah, super inspiring to have you on that.
Cool, thanks. If you could go back in time, and this is maybe, well, I'm just going to see where it takes us. If you could go back in time and give yourself a piece of advice, it could be at any stage of your life. Doesn't need to be like this, the musical part of your journey. But if you could go back and tell the younger version of you at any stage of your life, like a piece of advice, what would that be?
I think one thing that comes to mind would be practice piano more. So study piano, study notation early on. If I really wish that I had learned notation a lot earlier on. I wish that I had That's my battery, Marcus. So it's,
Oh,
I need to plug my phone in.
yeah.
But I'll just finish this thought first. Yeah, I wish that I would give myself advice to say, study notation, study scores, develop that side earlier, because there's things that I would really like to do now that I think I'm inhibited by because of that lack of knowledge. And I would like to be writing string quartets. I would like to be writing, and I can do that. I'm not inhibited from doing that, but I would love to have had that under my belt, beforehand. So to have sort of these more foundational musical systems and under my belt beforehand, that would be great.
Yeah, cool. Do you want to plug your phone in now, or?
Yeah, let me just look for my charger real quick. Hang on just a second. Now you have a beautiful picture of the ceiling.
Yes, nice acoustic treatment. Cool.
Okay.
Maybe as the last question for this section, what is the best mistake that you've done on your musical career? And usually what I mean by that, although you could interpret it in a different way, it's a decision you made that seemed like a mistake at the time, but later on you realized that it really played in your favor. Is there anything that comes to mind?
I think what comes to mind is not necessarily decisions, but shifting circumstances that sort of forced me. That seems to be a reoccurring theme, where certain events happen that forced me to change my situation. And so one thing that comes to mind is my work at Harmonix. I really I'd started with that company and really liked my job there. It was going great, and then it ended because, as these things do, the cycle of games, and then people get laid off, and they, at that point, they were kind of still early on, and they didn't really know what was coming next. And so, I took that as like, I mean, I don't want to like dramatize it and say it was like devastating, but it sort of felt that way a little bit. Felt like, I just sort of like got invested in and I got this great job in the music industry and video game, and I'm making music for it. And now, like there's nothing, right? That was sort of like this at the time, it felt like this very weighted thing. And I didn't want it, right? I was resisting that. And I looked at it as like a mishap. Of course, now looking back on it, it was the best thing that happened. If I had continued to stay there, I would have stayed there, right? And not really evolved or grown. Because because that job ended, I ended up moving to New York and working for this company where I got involved in creating music for TV, but also simultaneously that company launched a record label, and I ended up releasing my first proper Kodomo record on that label. And my entire career took off in a whole nother level, and financially that never would have been feasible working as an individual composer for that game company. So I think that's certainly one of those, like, in hindsight, that was like, it seemed like that situation seemed devastating and drastic, and then something completely that I could have never anticipated manifested and came about, through these various causes and conditions that ended up being, a much better situation, or being a situation that, I could evolve and grow in a way that I certainly would not have before. And there does seem to be this theme, because I tend to maybe get a little comfortable in situations, and then those situations sort of, it's almost like this invisible, like, okay, it's getting, we're pushing you out now. And then there's a little bit of free fall, and then something else manifests. But I'm kind of resistant towards, changing these situations. So I think it's actually a good thing, that these things end up happening.
Yeah, it's really the change that facilitates growth, and sometimes
very much so. And that's both on the personal level and on the artistic and professional level, for sure.
Yeah, sometimes our circumstances dictate how we have to change, but I'm a huge kind of advocate for people taking conscious and willing control over that themselves, yeah, as much as possible, because I mean, the more you can generate it in a positive way, the faster you're going to grow. And like you said, it's quite easy to find yourself in a comfortable spot, when you have your bases covered, and you go like, well, this isn't too bad. And while that certainly has perks, it might be damaging your other ventures, like creativity, for example.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's whenever, I think that's the constant dilemma. And as humans, we crave familiarity and comfort, and it's like it's this magnetic pull. But at the same time, it's not fulfilling. And so it's like we need that kind of we need enough comfort to be safe, from a practical angle, right? But we also need like an element of danger and unknown to actually like to help us grow and push us into new things, to actually, like, I think see our full potential. I think we're capable of so much more than we know of, or that we currently know about ourselves. We have this notion of, I never would have thought that, I'd be capable of like writing, TV scores and like doing all this, like that wasn't, but it happened. It happened out of it was what the situation occurred, and that's what happened. So I think particularly when working on records and working on our music, it's really critical. And to me, one of the impediments of working on my own music and as like a solo artist was that I was constantly just up against myself. So part of the impetus of starting the Foil Imprints, the label, was to really get a group of friends and collaborators together to be able to like work on stuff together, so that I wasn't up against my own comfort zone all the time, and that became clear that was actually pivotal if I'm going to continue to make music. That I can't just be doing it on my own.
Yeah. Well, you touched on like sources of inspiration. How about like physical location? Because, well, obviously you've been living around the world, and obviously you lived in New York City for quite a while, and now you're in Portland, Maine. So how do you find how much of that physical location plays into your inspiration, and or does it in some kind of deeper other way affect your creativity and mindset?
Yeah, I think the physical environment has always been an important component of contributing subconsciously to the music I make. I think I'm always taking in the surroundings, and my music is very much informed by physical places and or physical conditions like weather and you know, living in New York City and being surrounded by a lot of you know, the buildings, the concrete, and that atmosphere, I think has had a very specific you know, physical quality, and that gave rise to, you know, the music I was making there. And here it's I mean, this is kind of like ambient music heaven, because it's like you have all like the vibey weather with, you know, this very overcast, foggy, and then these just beautiful coastlines and this kind of minimalist environment. I think really is conducive to this very spacious, textural kind of music, which is, you know, ambient music is conceived being. I think that's definitely, I've shifted a lot towards sort of these more textural and ambient music focuses here.
Yeah. Do you have any concerns about kind of presumably you're going to live there for quite a few years into the future? Do you have any concerns about that kind of limiting the palette of the music that you're going to release, or do you have any strategies for like maybe traveling to kind of get back to some new different environments, or do you have any thoughts or strategies on that?
Yeah, I think, I mean, just experientially, what ends up happening is I get very invested in maybe a certain genre or area of music and explore it heavily, and then get a little tired or bored of it, and then I want to contrast, and I want to do the opposite. So I find, you know, one of the benefits of leaving here is it is a more isolating experience than, say, you know, a city like New York, certainly. And so there's sort of a deeper concentration through just lack of things going on in you know, a big city like that. And then the opposite of you know, that is, you know, I'm maybe a little more hungry for inspiration and or, you know, like cultural inspiration, let's just say, you know, and activity. But it's easy enough to kind of travel, you know, it's in proximity, so I can get down there, you know, as frequently as it's feasible to. And the other strategy is just trying to digest new art and new music, and that comes from listening to new releases, watching, you know, stuff on YouTube. You know, I'm sort of in touch with a lot of the music that's going on in Berlin right now, which is just incredible to me. They're just so ahead of it all, and kind of listening to what they're into, and just try, you know, I don't feel like I'm on top of it, but at least like I'm invested in listening to current stuff that's emerging that is really interesting, and that's certainly informing a lot of what will motivate me to explore musically.
Yeah. Okay, I think I'm gonna try and attempt to wrap this up because we've been going for such a good while, and I want to get you back to your normal life. But so, kind of final question here: what is your definition of an artist? And this could be kind of obviously a very difficult and can be, I guess, infinitely complex as a question, but. Or another way of asking that is, you know, what is the most important quality in an artist? But you could answer whichever one you want. It's sort of, in a sense, the same question, but
yeah. Well, it's interesting.
Artist?
The both first thought, best thought was the word that came to me was authenticity. So, and I think that's what I look for in terms of what the quality of a work of art or a piece of music, and I'm responding to, I think you are, and anyone else is responding to authenticity, and that's very quick. It comes across. You don't need to have studied this stuff. It's very immediate. I see this with my kid. Like immediately he likes Michael Jackson. Immediately he likes the Beastie Boys. It's just like bam, there it is. Immediately he likes Beethoven. Like great art is just, there's no barrier, and there's no barrier to authenticity, right? So that would be like the number one quality. And then I think there's this, to me, it really, like, great art, great music. I think there's this, a component of this inherent awareness and appreciation and curiosity for one's life and one's experience. And to me, that's what sort of great art embodies. It embodies this kind of boundless curiosity and discovery and genuine joy and enthusiasm for the pure act of being engaged in it, and that it's actually built in to the DNA of life itself. That somehow in the actual, like, components of our universe, there exists this inherent joy for creation. That the act of creation in and of itself is an inherently important and good thing. So I think that's what good art conveys, and that the byproduct of that is authenticity, because that would mean that, right, it's actually built in. It's not something that's like that comes afterwards. That's actually like part of what is inherent in existence, in my opinion.
Yeah, I think that's a beautiful answer. I think that's a pretty good place to wrap up.
Cool.
Well, I mean, unless something comes to mind, something you want to touch on with that we talked about, any sort of a message you want to leave to any of the listeners or viewers, now's your chance. But
I feel like I've maybe talked too much, so
that's not the case. But
okay.
Obviously, like a 3-hour session can have the effect of melting your brain. But you've been tremendously coherent and awesome.
Well, thank you for saying that, Markus. No, it's been great. Really super great questions, and really enjoyed this.
Cool. Yeah. Well, I appreciate you taking the time to do this and the effort. It's 3 hours is a hefty slice of your day, so I really appreciate it. And hopefully we can do this one day again. And get to the end of this list that I have here, which is a lot of questions. But I appreciate it, and I've learned so much from you, both from listening to your music, and obviously we've met in person actually before and had a good time, and I've learned a lot from you, both in music as well as just chatting. So thank you for that too.
Well, I would like to say thank you for what you're doing, because also your podcast and also your Instagram clips and I think what on engendering just really what I call like a better mental relationship really falls very much in line with the kind of mental training that I've been familiar with, certainly in in Buddhist thought, but I think it's so important, and it's so universal, and you've done it in a very eloquent, authentic way, and something that's very relatable. So thank you for your work, Markus.
Thanks for the kind words. Yeah, I think artists, especially, obviously a lot of this stuff is useful for just about anyone, but I try and help people I try and speak about what I know and help people who might be on the same path. So it's an important thing to do. And again, thanks for helping me move this podcast forward. But yeah. All right. Well, I think that's it for today. I'll just, we'll probably arrange something further down the line again. But thanks.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Cool. Thanks for your time and effort.
Yeah, thank you, Markus. Yeah, it was a real pleasure. Appreciate it.
Likewise.